Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
That on July 1st, when presumably about 200,000 Missourians are eligible for coverage, the state's going to have to provide it. This is what the proponents say. And if they don't, it's going to result in a lawsuit and a judge is going to force the state to do it. You've already heard some folks that are kind of expressing concern because he has no medical training, he's not a doctor, and now he's going to be running the Department of Health. So, it remains to be seen, but they say his position is interim, and they hope that it only lasts 30, 60 days at most.
And maybe get an actual physician in there, is the thinking?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to see probably a nationwide search to try to find someone to take that position. And, there's a lot of federal money coming in. It's probably a good position for somebody to take. If anybody's listening out there and wants to submit a resume, this would be the time. It's definitely not a time where you're going to have to be hacking and slashing.
So if you're dying to move to Jefferson City, Jason has a great opportunity for you. I'm Sarah Fensky. It's our Friday legislative update. The Missouri legislature has been busy in the last week. Not only did the House expel one of its members, but both the House and Senate have been debating some of the most contentious issues of our day. That includes the rights of transgender youth, as well as the 1619 Project. That's the New York Times initiative to reframe American history so that slavery and white supremacy are front and center. And it's not just hot-button issues driving debate. There's also news on the battle over Medicaid expansion. And here to get us up to speed on everything is Jason Hancock. He's the editor-in-chief of the Missouri Independent. That's the nonprofit news site covering all the news that's fit to print in Jefferson City. Jason, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jason, let's talk about Medicaid expansion. A few weeks ago, the Missouri House signed off on its budget. It had no funding for this. That's despite state voters approving an expansion of the program last year. So at that time, we were told it wasn't over yet. Is that still the case today?
It's not over yet, but it is definitely getting closer to the finale. So the fight moved to the Senate Appropriations Committee this week, where a Republican state senator from Springfield named Lincoln Huff tried to offer an amendment putting at least part of the funding back into the budget. He saw this as a compromise, and several of his Republican colleagues joined with him, arguing, look, we should probably do this. Not only was it passed by the voters, but if we don't and it ends up in the courts, it's going to be taken out of our hands. We should set the terms, and we should move forward. Came to a vote, and it tied 7-7, which means it was defeated. And so it was 3 Republicans and 4 Democrats voting in support of putting expansion money in there, 7 Republicans voting against. And so the budget is going to come out of committee without that, which sets up next week. The full Senate is going to take up the budget for debate. And that's where the last fight, at least of this session, theoretically, will take place, is on the Senate floor. And we'll see if a coalition of folks can get that money back in, or if the majority party is going to be successful in keeping it out.
So a tie in committee, there obviously is some appetite to get this back into this budget at the same time that there's people who clearly don't want to see this happen. Do you have any sense of how things could break down once the full Senate is there?
Well, we always knew there was going to be a floor fight regardless of how this played out in committee. There's a dedicated group of conservative senators in the Senate that argue that the voters, even by passing Medicaid expansion, they cannot constitutionally tie the legislature's hand and force them to fund it. And they're saying they're representing their districts, where in rural Missouri overwhelmingly voted against Medicaid expansion. And so that's what their argument was going to be. On the other side, you have Democrats now. The money didn't get into the budget. There's concern that maybe that now they'll hold up the budget. There is a deadline of early May. They have to pass the budget. And if they do not, they're going to have to call themselves back into special session and start the process over again. And so, like I said, I think there's going to be a fight on the floor. I think ultimately most folks think that this is going to be settled in a courtroom, that on July 1st, when presumably 200,000 Missourians are eligible for coverage. The state's going to have to provide it. This is what the proponents say. And if they don't, it's going to result in a lawsuit and a judge is going to force the state to do it. And I think that's where we're headed.
There was some talk that rural hospitals and that other interests in the state might be pushing hard to make sure that this happens. Are you aware? Has there been a lot of lobbying on members to shift their position on this?
I mean, they're definitely getting involved. I mean, people on all sides of this. I mean, this is a huge issue. This is hundreds of millions of dollars, I think, that we're talking about here. And so, yeah, there's definitely efforts on both sides. The governor was asked about this yesterday. He put it in his budget. The House removed it. And he was asked what he thought about that. He was sort of circumspect. He didn't really, he hasn't laid down the gauntlet and said, put it in or I'll veto. He hasn't said, this is what I want. He sort of said, well, the legislature is going to do what it's going to do. And he feels like he hesitates to jump into this thing until it's on his desk. But on July 1st, when expansion is supposed to take place, it's going to be his problem one way or another. And so everybody's sort of looking to him as well to see, is the governor going to jump into this debate? Is the governor going to lay down a marker? Because he obviously is the leader of his party and could have some considerable sway on where this debate heads.
So speaking of Governor Parson, there was a surprising departure from his cabinet this week, or perhaps just surprising to me. But Dr. Randall Williams, who's the director of the Department of Health and Senior Services, he's gone. And Fox 2 KTVI reports that Governor Parson said he asked Dr. Williams to resign. Do we know why?
That's been the mystery. Nobody really knows why. The governor kind of hinted that this was a decision that was a long time coming. He said something in his press conference yesterday about it's hard to recruit people to these sort of high-profile positions when you're running for office because you don't know if you're going to win or not, which sort of, to me, kind of indicated that this is something he's been thinking about. But it was a strange answer from the governor because he praised Randall Williams, said he did a great job, said he was happy with his performance, but he then admitted that he asked him to resign suddenly on Tuesday with no explanation and with nobody in place to take his job. And so he elevated his deputy chief of staff to an acting director position. But so it is sort of it's become an interesting parlor game in Jefferson City as what happened to Randall Williams. He'd been such a high profile member of the governor's cabinet, been out front not only on the pandemic, but for years before on a number of issues with, the Planned Parenthood's license to perform abortion, medical marijuana. For him to just be gone out of nowhere with no explanation, it's definitely set people to chattering, and maybe one day we'll figure this thing out.
So Missouri garnered a lot of national news coverage for the slow vaccine rollout, having vaccine deserts in the metro areas. Is it fair to pin that in part on Williams and his leadership of that department?
I mean, I guess the argument could be made that, as the guy that runs the department, the buck stops there. I think the governor would say the successes or failures of his administration are his. He is the leader of it. It's worth noting that the person that's going to be taking over, at least on an interim basis, is Robert Nodell, who has been leading the administration's vaccine program. And so it's not a complete break from leadership on that front, at least, as the state continues to roll this program out. If Robert Nodell, he's the deputy chief of staff for the governor, is still in charge of this program, it just has a different title and taking on new responsibilities, presumably this would be sort of a seamless transition, at least in regards to the vaccine program. But you've already heard some folks that are kind of expressing concern because he has no medical training, he's not a doctor, and now he's going to be running the Department of Health. So, it remains to be seen, but they say his position is interim, and they hope that it only lasts 30, 60 days at most.
And maybe get an actual physician in there, is the thinking?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to see probably a nationwide search to try to find someone to take that position. And, there's a lot of federal money coming in. It's probably a good position for somebody to take. If anybody's listening out there and wants to submit a resume, this would be the time. It's definitely not a time where you're going to have to be hacking and slashing. So
if you're dying to move to Jefferson City, Jason has a great opportunity for you. Our guest today is Jason Hancock. He's the editor-in-chief of the Missouri Independent, the nonprofit news site. Jason, speaking of resignations, last Friday you brought us up to speed on the allegations against Representative Rick Raber. His children had charged him with abusing them, and this is back when they were kids. He, at that point, had tried to resign. The House said no. What happened in this past week on this story?
The House moved forward with their ethics process. There was a complaint filed against him in January, which started this ethics investigation into these allegations that you mentioned. It came to a head in the last few weeks. What we've learned is on Monday they released their report, the Ethics Commission, that documented what they had found and sort of how the process had played out. They interviewed his children. They interviewed his ex-wife. They found them credible. They found him, I think the words that they used were, angry, abusive, and not credible, and ultimately recommended unanimously that he be expelled from the House. That was Monday. The report came to a vote on Wednesday, and 153 lawmakers voted in favor of expelling Rick Raber. Nobody voted against. There was one person who voted present, which, I think he was an attorney, and there was some sort of perceived conflict that he felt. I'm not sure exactly why he voted present, but it was a unanimous vote to expel him on Wednesday, and he becomes only the second person to ever be expelled from the House, and the first since the Civil War.
Wow!
So it's a pretty monumental decision that the House made.
And did he try to fight this at all? Show up and speak in his defense?
He did not. So when they first approved this report, they put this in their report, that they reached out to him, told him what they had determined, told him that what they were going to recommend, and he said he was going to resign. A few days later, he rescinded and said, nope, I want to have a hearing. I want to fight this. And then just a few days after that is when news broke that the committee, or I should say House leadership, had reached out to Jackson County Prosecutor Jean Peters Baker, expressing concern that he still had regular visitation with a young child and asking her to intervene. Shortly after that news came out, he resigned again. And as you pointed out, the House decided this time, no, it's like we talked about this last week. It's the opposite of the "you can't fire me because I quit." They literally said, you cannot quit because we want to fire you. And they mentioned that the children haven't had justice for decades, and they feel like their voices have been silenced. They wanted to at least give them some semblance of justice, and this is how they felt they could do it.
So Rick Raber has been fired. Now, we're talking about children. As I mentioned earlier, there were some hot-button issues debated in both chambers this past week, and one of these discussions involved transgender youth. What was the proposal being discussed over this?
So yeah, this is an issue that's come up a lot around the country. There was a bill passed in Kansas and just, I think yesterday, vetoed by the governor over there. But here in Missouri, a representative named Chuck Basie, who's a Republican from Roachport, had a proposal that was attached to an education bill that would have prohibited transgender students from participating on sports teams that match their gender identity. And basically the argument Republicans were making was, biological boys should not be competing against girls. That was the Republican argument. Obviously, Democrats and a fair amount of Republicans as well pushed back against this, argued that there's already, regulations in place from the High School Sports Association here in Missouri that govern this, that this is a solution in search of a problem. And, they felt as though that this was just singling out these kids who have it hard enough, have high suicide rates, and are just targeting them. The House ultimately passed this 100 yes to 51 no's, put it onto a bill. But for the second day in a row, the bill ended up getting laid over. There was no final vote. So this bill's still kind of stuck in the House, attached to a larger education bill. And then yesterday, Senate leadership actually said they just don't see that this is going to be an idea that gets a lot of traction. It's too late in the session, too much emotion, it's too divisive. And, Missouri has a hard deadline of, I think it's May 14th this year at 6:00. Everything has to pass or it's dead. And so this bill still being stuck in the House, I think, has doomed it. But it's raised the issue quite a bit and is obviously not something that's not going to go away anytime soon, at least in the Missouri legislature.
I mentioned the New York Times 1619 project. This apparently also ended up coming up in the middle of this debate. What does this have to do with that? And also, what does it have to do with Missouri?
Yeah, so the transgender athletes bill, or I should say the transgender athletes provisions, were attached to a larger bill. And that debate kind of spanned over the course of a couple days. They passed that amendment, put it on the bill, and the next thing that happened was there was another amendment suggested by a Republican that would prohibit the state or at least public schools, from using the 1619 project or other curriculum that, as they say, identifies people, entities, or institutionally or institutions as inherently or systemically sexist, racist, biased, privileged, or oppressed. So basically, they don't want that curriculum in public schools. That sparked another lengthy debate, and ultimately the bill was laid over once again. And so the fact that they ended up on the same bill is essentially just that I think the bill itself kind of opened up education as a topic. And so now you have these two really controversial hot button issues in the same bill, and a bill that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. But it has become a point of contention for Republicans, this project, and how they feel as though it demonizes America's history.
Your publication quoted House Minority Leader Crystal Quaid saying basically, we all know this bill isn't going to become law. We're out of time. This is just people grandstanding for future elections. Do you think she had a point with that?
I mean, grandstanding for future elections, it's definitely possible. I mean, every year we have these bills that kind of percolate up, get a lot of attention, draw a lot of heat. And usually, a vast majority of bills just don't become law. And especially in the House, which passes a lot more bills than the Senate because there's no filibuster, you do have bills that, a lot of us refer to them as newsletter bills, but bills that the state reps can then tell their constituents, like, this is what I did, and now we're off to the Senate in the hopes of, getting this done. A lot of those bills end up just crashing into opposition in the Senate. But to the representative's point, it is very late in the session to be debating this stuff. Again, when it hasn't crossed over to the other chamber yet, you're really running out of time because the Senate's still got to deal with the budget. Then this House and the Senate have to confer to work out differences on the budget. There's any number of other hot button issues that are further along in the process. And it's every day, the most precious commodity to the legislature right now is time. So any minute spent debating the 1619 project is one where you're not debating a bill that maybe has a better chance of getting across the finish line.
Well, Jason Hancock, editor-in-chief of the Missouri Independent, I want to thank you for that analysis and for this very busy and packed legislative update.
Absolutely, anytime.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here. If you learned something new from today's episode, consider leaving us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the easiest way to help people discover our show. We appreciate it. Thank you. St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri, St. Louis.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.